I'm Emily Kumler, and this is Empowered Health. Most of us are familiar with Time's Up as a hashtag that came about after the sort of Me Too movement and the Weinstein allegations started spreading around. And it's now turned into an organization that's all about sort of making sure that women in the workplace are safe and respected, as well as given an opportunity for success that equals their male counterparts. The organization just launched Time's Up Healthcare, which is going to be a branch under the larger organization. And we talked to the new executive director on her very first day about what Time's Up Healthcare is hoping to accomplish and why there's a real need for it now. And speaking of need, we are really grateful for those of you who have donated through Patreon. And we're hoping to have more of you join in that. Podcast is definitely a lot of work, and Jill and I really love doing it, but we have to find a way to make it sustainable in the next few months. So if you are a regular listener, or even if you just stop in from time to time, just like you pay for your Starbucks coffee or your drive-through McMuffins, which we really hope you're not eating, but if you are, fine. Just think about this as your sort of daily dose of information, or your weekly or your monthly or your couple times a year. Whatever you think is appropriate, we would appreciate. Again, we're spending a significant amount of our time working on this to share information that we think is really vital to living your happiest, healthiest life. And we'd really appreciate your donations. So go to patreon.com/empoweredhealth. Or you can go directly to our site, and there is a Patreon link right on our homepage, which you can click on and donate there. Thanks very much.
So I'm Dr. Lauren Powell. I am the new executive director for Time's Up Healthcare.
Congratulations on the new job. Today's day one, right?
Today is day one, yes.
You hit the ground running.
Yes.
I think a good place to start would be to just sort of talk a little bit about what Time's Up Healthcare is. A lot of people are going to be familiar with Time's Up as the larger movement, but what is this specific initiative about?
Yes, Time's Up Healthcare is an organization I'm elated to be joining under the larger umbrella of Time's Up Now. But Time's Up Healthcare is very special in the sense that it is focused specifically on creating the conditions for equity and safe, dignified work environments for women, particularly working in healthcare. And so that's just a little bit more specific than what the larger Time's Up movement is focused on, which is focused on equity for women, period. What I really like about the Time's Up larger organizations is that they have been very thoughtful in creating industry-specific initiatives in order to create targeted change by industry. And so healthcare is the newest addition to that family. We know that healthcare is a major employer specifically for women. And so the focus of Time's Up Healthcare is really doing that, creating safe and dignified work environments, leading to equitable conditions for women of all types, of all ages, of all different occupations working in healthcare.
And so I think this was like one of the first years where there were more women that graduated from medical school than men. Is that right?
I actually am not sure specifically about that statistic, but I would not be surprised if that's the case. I know for other industries that are very sort of tangential to healthcare, also part of healthcare, public health, for example, is overwhelmingly dominated by women.
Yep. And I know some of the stats that we have are like 80% of the healthcare workforce is female.
Absolutely.
Yet only 20% of leadership is female. So there's like a big, wait, what? When it comes to that?
Exactly. A huge disparity, a huge inequity there, that if we have so many women who are making up the workforce, how is it that they are not being promoted equitably and they are not reaching these positions of high leadership and power within this industry that we so overwhelmingly make up?
My understanding is that part of the impetus for starting Time's Up Healthcare was an article that came out of the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering that found that women who are in STEM careers, probably studying in STEM careers, I think, were more likely to face some sort of harassment. That to me, on the one hand, isn't that surprising, unfortunately. But on the other hand, it's hard to reconcile that with the push that we've done of like trying to get girls into STEM programs and trying to drum up. I mean, I went to Smith College undergrad, and there was a big program shortly after I graduated to do a joint like sort of engineering thing with Dartmouth, and everybody was all excited about it. And I think, gosh, it's sort of one of these, obviously it's not tragic, but like we have all of these women who we've, said, hey, you can do it too. Math isn't scary. Like get in there, mix up the sciences. Women need to be more involved. And then you hear these stories of like women dropping out because they're being harassed, or, it's just so the work environment as a student trying to get a PhD under some, awful advisor who's the only, the best in the country. And so you feel like you have to study under them. Like it's pervasive, right? And so how do you counter that? Like, what are we going to do about that?
This is why I'm so excited about being a part of Time's Up Healthcare and about a part of Time's Up in general is, you started off kind of talking about how there's been such a big push of like pushing women and girls into science, math, science, engineering, all of that, into even the medical field, right? But this is the difference between raising awareness and actually changing a system, right? So we can push people into what we think is a great system, but if we're not actually tackling the inequities and the pitfalls within the system, we're going to have the same outcomes. And so Times Up Healthcare is about focusing on changing the work environment, changing the policies, changing the people in power, changing all of that so that when we are encouraging women to go into healthcare related fields, to go into science, to go into advertising, or, any of the other initiatives that we are currently, spearheading, that we're pushing them into safe and equitable work environments.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the difference, right, in the conversation that we're having now. It's not just, this is a great path for you to take and there's not enough women, let's just encourage them, or let's create pipelines for them to get in. It's how do we support women and ensure that they are reaching their highest potential in the work environments that we are also encouraging them to go into.
Right. And that it's not about just going in and like, being accepted to the engineering PhD program. It's about being able to thrive when you're there.
Right. The difference between, diversity and inclusion, right? Diversity, just inviting and making a pool more diverse, does not actually mean inclusion. That doesn't mean I feel included. That doesn't mean things are equitable for me, right? That doesn't mean that I have the same opportunities to achieve the highest potential as someone else, right? So this is also very analogous to the diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of shift that I feel like the country is moving towards. And this is also why I'm excited about this position. I'm excited about this opportunity, this organization, because it is a very logical move away from just talking about diversity in lots of different ways, right? Intersectionality, talking about diversity through race, through gender, through sexual orientation, but it's moving towards equity, which requires us to do more than just talk about diversity, but to create a level playing field and to talk about power structures. And that's really what we're doing here.
So talk to me a little bit about how do you do that?
Well, I think there's a number of different ways that you do that. I think that engaging with, some of the gatekeepers and some of the folks who have the most power, right? So that's CEOs, that's certainly a lot of men who we know who overwhelmingly make up these positions. So that is helping people understand that sexual assault, sexual harassment, and equitable working conditions, especially in healthcare, is something that impacts your bottom line in healthcare. That impacts patient care, which is certainly of utmost importance in healthcare. That also impacts, revenue and your representation as an organization, as a hospital, as a healthcare provider. So I think making this something that is of tangible importance to leaders in healthcare is number one. I think lifting up the voices of survivors and lifting up solutions that come from survivors is certainly another very important way to do that. I think tackling policies in the workplace is an important way to do that. Specifically, the way that sexual assault and sexual harassment is reported how is that followed up on, right? How is that disciplined? Is that seen as something that should be disciplined? So again, changing the work environment, and as well, hoping that changes also who some of the gatekeepers are, right? Making sure that we're changing and moving away from this statistic of women overwhelmingly making up the healthcare workforce, but not making up leadership positions.
It's funny. Jill, my producer, and I were just talking about how, and, I don't want to get too tangential, but it feels related to me that there's this idea of, as a woman walking through a dark parking lot, you're kind of in the back of your mind feeling like, okay, I could get raped, or this, I could get attacked, or something could happen. It's not out of the realm of possibility, even if statistically it's highly unlikely that something would happen to you. I feel like it's a thought that crosses most women's minds, right? Yeah. Yet if I were to say to my husband, or when I have said to him, I think women are sort of the warrior class because we're always aware of our surroundings in a sort of heightened sense because of danger, right? Or because of potential threat, which I think is something we don't talk a whole lot about. I think that there's a sort of general awareness of that, women to women, just kind of get that they are used to walking through the parking lot with the keys between their fingers, right? Or something that somebody taught you along the way that you should do. Mm-hmm. But, it is interesting because when you share those kinds of experiences with men, the most common response is oh, that's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. Or oh, what? There's this sort of either surprise and dismiss, or just general, what? Oh, I never think of that. And I had this over the summer. I was traveling in Peru. I think I've shared this story on the podcast before, but one of the guys I was traveling with was talking about how one of these villages that we were in was really cool to walk around late at night, that the lighting in the cobblestone street was, and I was like, wow, that's really cool. Maybe you could go out again and I could go with you. I'm not going to do that by myself. And he was sort of talking about how it was sort of a spiritual experience for him by himself. And I was like, God, that's not, it's not fair. I can't do that. Right. Yeah. And it's it's just reality, right? I'm not going to, put myself in a dangerous situation so that I can experience this sort of beautiful moment, because I have to weigh the benefit and the risk. Right. But I think to your point, this idea, we talk a lot about how we need more women in positions of power. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that feels lacking in that is men are I'm sensitive, there are very sensitive men out there, right? That are in power, that are trying to do their best. But there is something about having the experience of it that you just can't empathize with.
I really appreciate you bringing this scenario kind of to light and to talk about it this way. As you were talking, I was thinking about how that is an experience that I feel in being a Black woman, right? In navigating society as a Black woman, as someone who's Black, and then someone who's a Black woman. Mm-hmm. And that, sometimes I have to work extra hard to make it clear just how different I have to operate in society, to the point that, it's surprising to people. It's oh, I never thought about it that way. Just as you described, when you were in Peru, someone said, oh, you could go and have this lovely experience. And you're thinking, yeah, I could in broad daylight, perhaps, and maybe mm-hmm. someone who I trust with me. And I feel that way as well sometimes as I'm navigating the world. And not at all to, equate race and gender, though I do think there are intersections there, right? There are very important overlaps. But I think that to help increase empathy, or to help increase understanding and awareness, we really have to have some frank conversations with people who just do not have the same lived experience. They just really don't.
Right.
Prior to this position, I was working in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I was the director of health equity for the state of Virginia. And that was overwhelmingly, people ask me, well, what do you do in your job? How do you spend your days? How do you tackle this issue of health equity? And I said, overwhelmingly, I spend most of my time helping people see that your frame of reality and lived experience is not like everyone else's. Mm. And that there are differences in the way that people are raised. There are differences in the life experiences people have based on their social identities often. And that in order for us to get to health equity, we have to be aware of the fact that my lived experience is not yours, right? And so I think that I'm certainly bringing that to this role, and that to increase equity for women, to enhance the workspace and workplace opportunities and fairness and safety for women in the workplace, we have to help people understand just how unsafe it is right now, right? Just how difficult it can be to be a woman, to be the top of your game and to still be overlooked, to be made to feel unsafe in just wanting to come to work and do your job.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There are quite a few people who don't have that frame of reference. And I see that as an important role in this position as well.
You're reminding me of another really profound conversation I had that was after, it might have been like after Weinstein, like after that story broke. But a teacher I had at Harvard Law School, I did not go to Harvard Law School, but I did the negotiation training there and the mediation certification. And he and I sometimes just like go out for drinks and kind of catch up about stuff. And we were talking about everything. And he basically is, I would say, one of the most emotionally intelligent, sort of empathetic, really, I mean, his whole job is looking at things from other perspectives. Mm-hmm. And in the course of this conversation, which was a very casual, we were having drinks, like not a high stress situation at all. He was saying to me that he had really been hit over the head with some of the Me Too stuff, in the sense that he kind of knew some of the stuff went on, right? I mean, like, as we all did, but he was able to sort of put in perspective the guy who was his mentor, and that had that man been hitting on him, right, let alone raping him or anything else, while he was in law school, he would have dropped out of school. Mm-hmm. And that he would never have had this sort of illustrious career that he's had, where he's gone on to, publish great books and he runs this incredible program now at Harvard Law School. And I think there was something really fascinating to me and satisfying about having that conversation, because it made me realize, like, it takes a lot of work it takes a lot of work for me to imagine what it would be like to be a Black woman, or what it would be like to be a Black man in this country, right? That's not something that I can say I have any understanding of, right? Mm-hmm. And I certainly wouldn't want to be in a position where I was acting like I did. Mm-hmm. And to have this person who I really respect sort of acknowledge that, in the sense of acknowledging how detrimental it would have been to his entire life trajectory, right? Mm-hmm. And that, like, the influence of having somebody mentor you, or having somebody be your boss, right? Or having somebody be your teacher, and then sort of negatively weighing on you. Where the conversation ended up going was, I had a realization that, like, basically almost all of my male mentors have sort of hit on me or done something inappropriate in some way. Mm. And I feel like I've always pushed back on them, and it's never turned into a situation that I would consider to be, truly to have crossed the line where it made me not want to be around them anymore. But what it did do was it created a question of confidence, right? Or a question of ability. Like, are they trying to sleep with me? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's not because I'm some brilliant young journalist, right? Mm-hmm. Or am I a brilliant young journalist that they're investing in because I'm a brilliant young journalist, right? Like, then this sort of the idea of, like, imposter syndrome boils up, and you're like, for the rest of your life, like, did I get that job because that person, wanted to get in my pants, even though they never did? Mm-hmm. Right? Or was it because they recognized that I was going to be really good at the job, or both, right? Or some combination. And that was fascinating to talk to him about, because he was like, that has never crossed my mind. Never. He's never thought once, like, this old man who's, some illustrious lawyer or judge or whatever is trying to sleep with me. And it was so interesting for us to have this conversation as two, successful people looking back on our careers and realizing how different our confidence is about what we do, in large part because of those sort of interplays with people that we looked up to and respected, and that held the keys to our careers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A couple of the things that you sort of just hit on are, I think, of profound importance if we take a deeper dive looking at healthcare, right? You mentioned kind of imposter syndrome, right? Questioning your ability. Healthcare is something that is central to all of us, right? Like all of us need healthcare at some point.
Mm-hmm.
If we are not creating an environment where women feel safe and feel that they can work to their optimal level, right? We are introducing the possibility of those feelings. And healthcare is not a place where we want to introduce the questioning of ability, imposter syndrome, psychological, distress, emotional distress, having to deal and cope with sexual assault, sexual harassment. This is a place where women are making life-changing decisions every moment. We think about nurses, home healthcare aides, community health workers, even folks working in public health. It's important that we create the environment for people to feel, for women especially, to feel like they can come and work to the best of their ability in a safe place so that they're sharpest at their game, right? Because when we introduce the opportunity for that to not be the case, we're also introducing errors that can lead to, dismal patient outcomes that can perpetuate health inequities. I just appreciate you lifting up that point because I think that's of paramount importance, specifically when we're talking about healthcare in the healthcare field.
I think the interplay with patients, I feel like we have a lot of doctors who listen to the podcast, but we also obviously have a lot of women who are interested in navigating their own healthcare because the podcast is mostly looking at sex differences in, sort of medicine and life experience. One of the questions that I would put to you is like, what do you have any idea, either from your past experience or, looking at the organization now of like how this sort of trickle down affects women as patients?
So I don't have specific knowledge of that. There's a slightly nuanced way I can answer your question. And that is that I do understand the impacts slightly of trauma, right? Of trauma and sort of psychological distress, of stress, chronic stress as a form of, that can lead to long-term health inequities. And so one other point that you'd made, I think a couple minutes ago, was just the feeling of anxiety and kind of knowing that maybe a mentor or someone else had, made sexual advances to you and made you feel uncomfortable, right? Like that's traumatic. And as we are in a society that is more fully embracing trauma-informed care and just recognizing trauma, certainly I cannot speak specifically to statistics, but I can certainly speak from having heard from survivors that is a traumatic experience and that can have long-term impacts. And so I'm excited in the sense that, Times of Healthcare is a platform, is a place for us to serve as a beacon of light and hope, but to also make sure this conversation remains relevant and that we continue to uplift this as a problem so that we are not continuing to traumatize women.
Well, yeah. And I'm sort of just thinking about this a little bit as you're talking. And I'm realizing that like I did a story for the New York Times on maternal mortality. And then we did 2 episodes on maternal mortality, one specifically looking at race. And one of the things that was so interesting to me was the fear that is now felt, I think, for women in general in America, but specifically for Black women who are pregnant about going to the hospital.
Yes.
One of the big takeaways for me was that women clearly felt more comfortable if their OB was Black, and if it was a Black woman, that was best case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And so, sort of reverse engineering this a little bit, it's like if women are marginalized in a way where they feel uncomfortable, harassed, assaulted, the whole range while in medical school or while training, then they're less likely to ever become that sort of profession, right? Which means that women don't have access to those female providers.
Absolutely. That's an absolutely credible and really great point. We could take it a step further. I think that the experiences of being a woman, is one thing in America. The experience of being a Black woman is a totally different thing in America. And then to be a Black woman who is perhaps a medical provider, right? If we're introducing the potential for harassment, inequities, sexual assault, all of those things, and again, using the scenario with maternal mortality, we're not creating the picture for a Black woman in particular to be at the very top of her game and to be the best provider that this Black woman who's a patient is asking for and that who needs. And so I appreciate you bringing up that point, because I do think I'm excited, because another really important cornerstone to Times of Healthcare is intersectionality. And that is fully recognizing that race and gender and sexual orientation, all these things overlap and intersect.
Mm-hmm.
Not something we can ignore. That has something that we are very cognizant of, that we are very inclusive of, and that we are creating initiatives that make sure we target and include all of these groups, that all of these groups of women are important parts of our healthcare system and are important to the tapestry of healthcare.
Yeah. And I mean, I would just push a plug there for like even starting with research, right? Like pharmaceutical companies test female mice like rarely, right? Even if the product is going to be mostly used by women. It's like the discrepancy in clinical trials is unbelievable that there is such a lack of female representation in that. Not that you're going to like for mice rights, but in terms of like the trickle down effect of like, we don't even know what the drug's impact is on female bodies. That for me is like, it starts there. Do you know what I mean? And that's different than what you guys are working on, but it's like, it's just so rampant that there is this general disregard for the lack of care, I would say, or attention to the equality between, I don't know. I mean, you could put it a lot of different ways, but it's really systemic. I mean, which is part of the reason I was just so excited to talk to you, because I feel like breaking out healthcare, wow, like that's a big, I feel like that for me is really an optimistic move of like where we are, that we're at the point where we're recognizing there are these branches of this problem. And yes, there's this overarching, theme of inequality, but actually like looking at it within different, whether it's like industry, profession, whatnot, is a much more, systematized approach to solving the problem, right?
Right. And in recognizing that there are specific nuances to each of these industries that only someone working in that industry would really know.
Mm-hmm.
And those things sort of impact who's promoted over who isn't. So let's think specifically about healthcare. We can think about like journal articles, and who is selected to be published in, top tier journals. More often than not, it is certainly men, and it's certainly white men. Mm-hmm. And so that has a lot of impact on who is promoted within, the academic ranks of medical schools and in other training facilities and other training.
Well, and all the big prizes, right? Like there's all these algorithms now that say like, if you publish and sell this many times, your chances of winning a Nobel is this. Like,
right.
It's all interconnected.
Right. And so the system is skewed. And so I'm just so excited because we're about systems change, right? We're also about changing the hearts and minds of people. It's inevitable that, we have to, in order to change the system, you also have to change the hearts and minds of the people who operate the system. And so, that's kind of the tandem goal of healthcare, of Times of Healthcare.
But what's also like just coming to mind as you're sparking all of these things that I want to make sure we talk about. But I think there's something interesting about what happens at med school too, right? And I'm sure this happens, at various levels of the process. But the idea that profiling is still like sort of the main way that people learn through case studies is really interesting, right? I mean, there's been a lot written on this about how women have a higher pain threshold than men, likely, but that women's pain is very often just disregarded as the woman being, sort of complaining too much or not having a high enough threshold. My understanding is that that's really taught, right? That there are these sort of like, you have to look at a case and then sort of make judgments, generalizations about what is the person's, what is their background? What sex are they? What are they complaining of? What could it be? Which, the doctor needs to be able to do in real time and be quick and accurate and all of that stuff. But at the same time, you're interplaying in there all of these biases, right? Yeah. That were written by whoever wrote the case study.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that scenario also extends to other racial and ethnic groups.
Definitely.
So African Americans, for example, pain is the same scenario you're speaking of, right? That that Black people have a higher threshold for pain and are underprescribed pain medication. And so, yes, there is insidiousness to the biases that have been systematically and systemically introduced into, the medical field and training in medicine and in several other, nuanced pieces of healthcare. I see this as a platform to address inequity specifically for women, but in addressing that, there are so many other inequities that need to be addressed as well. And in the introduction of bias in that way, and the way that you've pointed out through case studies in medical schools in particular, that's another example. Mm-hmm. That's another, excellent example. And I am excited because I think, we do have some signatory organizations who have signed on and said, we believe in times of healthcare. We want to improve our policies and improve our ways of doing things and to make better and inclusive and equitable conditions for women. And so some of the initiatives that are signatories, we've just gotten some preliminary reporting back on that. Some of those, include initiatives like this. And I think that this is the opportunity, this is the platform to really push changes in medical school curriculum and the way medical schools select their students and the way nursing schools, train their nurses and select their students. The sky's really kind of the limit. We won't be able to do everything at once, but I do definitely see, branching out into the way that we are actually training people in healthcare as certainly being, something to go after.
And then what do you say to the people? I feel like there's been a lot of press in the last month or so that I've just sort of randomly come upon talking about how like men are terrified to mentor women now. I have a very strong reaction to that, which is sort of like, if you're not being inappropriate, you don't have a problem. But I'm curious, like when you go into a big organization or a corporation or a hospital or whatever, and you sort of are thinking about how to tackle this problem and doing it in a way that doesn't have a backlash, which I'm sure every movement has a backlash and that's part of the progress. But how do you tackle something like that?
Well, I think, including men in our conversations and as a part of this movement is imperative. Mm-hmm. And so while I don't think that means watering things down, because there is still a necessity to the reality, like we need to be real in talking about these challenges. I do think that there is a way to be welcoming, but to still be firm about like the need for this, the necessity for focusing specifically on women. On one hand, it's important that we're inclusive of men. On the other hand, as you've mentioned, if you've not done anything wrong, there's nothing you should be worried about, right? So it's in my opinion, it's just reinforcing the way to work equitably with women that it's just about being a good colleague, kind of being a good colleague and being a good mentor. And perhaps there are things that need to be reiterated on how to do that. And I do think it's very unfortunate that, I've heard that mentioned. And I think that's an unfortunate way to look at things, that men are now afraid to mentor women. But the reality is, because there are so many men that are in leadership positions, there have to be men that mentor women, because so many of them are gatekeepers at this point.
Well, and I think that's the argument, right? Like, this has done a disservice to women because now men don't want them in the room because they're scared they might say the wrong thing.
And I can see that as a point. But I think, again, that absolves us of actually looking at the system, right? There is a system in this, what we're now talking about is interpersonal relationships, which are certainly important, but there's a system that continues to allow men to float to the top. And so if we had a different system that then promoted more women to C-suite type positions, and to lots of different positions of leadership, then this wouldn't be, I don't think that this would be such an issue. I personally don't think this would be such an issue. But I can understand that is a perspective. I think that, being inclusive of men in this movement is one way to try to counteract that. I do think that there are, a handful of men who will maybe feel this way no matter what. But my sort of pushback on that would be, well, what is the alternative? What is the alternative? To not speak openly and to not, create a movement around equity for women and to allow things to continue to perpetuate as they've been. I think there's always going to be a backlash, as you've mentioned. There's a backlash in any movement. That's what social movements are. That's what social justice is about.
Yeah, and I'm sure I'll get pushback for this, but I feel like the undercurrent of what you're saying to me is that there is a power set, right? And like we haven't really wanted to say that or like acknowledge it so outright, but that the power set is starting to crumble. And as, women in different minority groups sort of move up the ranks, that's threatening. And so it's almost like trying to convince the people who are still part of that power set, like this is here and it's not going away. So like in some ways you've got to sort of get on board and we've got to all figure this out. But there does seem to be a sort of like I often say that it's like a fish when you see a fish dying and it's like flapping around. It's like, that's the optimism, like the optimist in me that sort of is like, sometimes you hear comments from people, in our government or whatnot, and you sort of think like, what is happening? Like, and I think you see things like more women graduating from med school in that space. And certainly on this podcast, one of the goals that we had was to try to have more female sources than male sources. And it hasn't been hard at all because so many women get to a point in their career where they can actually raise the money to do the research they really want to do. And it turns out they want to do that research on sex differences because throughout their career, they were prescribing medicine that wasn't impacting women the same way it was impacting men, or they were diagnosing a disease based on male anatomy, knowing full well that their anatomy was different, right? I mean, I think we see these changes coming about, and anybody who's sort of obtuse to them, right, and that is sort of hanging on to the old way just for the sake of the old way, right? There may be things about the old way that are, to your point, systematic, that are hard to change, or that people don't understand what the benefit will be. But those who are just hanging on, that to me just feels like insecurity.
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. The other kind of question I would ask some of these men who feel this way is, if your daughter worked in a company, would you want her treated that way?
Mm-hmm.
If your mother or your sister worked in a company, would you want them treated that way? Right. So again, I think that the excitement around Times of Healthcare is that I see this as, two-pronged approach, maybe three, but two-pronged for sure. Changing hearts and minds, like asking you to put yourself in the situation of, or being connected to another woman or someone else you really care about and asking, would you want them treated that way? Changing hearts and minds. Like, I think sometimes we have to push people to think outside of their own realm of reality, right? Your lived experience is yours, but it is not everyone else's.
Mm-hmm.
It's changing the system. Systems change so that mentorship doesn't only have to come from men in order for women to get to the top.
Right. And I also think we talk about this a lot here too. The idea of like women really, truly helping each other.
Yes.
That there isn't a finite number of spots for a woman and that you are in competition with the one other woman. That it's like you can actually both help each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The only other thing I would say is we're just getting started. I'm excited. This is my first day, my first interview on my first day.
Yay.
Thank you for the opportunity. But we certainly, we will only be as successful as the communities that we're able to champion as well. And so I am excited to be leading this charge. I want to encourage your listeners to join us in this. You can join us by texting Times Up HC to 30644. Change really only happens when millions of people stand up and speak out. And as you can see, we're moving in that direction. We have had lots of initiatives with Times Up already. Times Up Healthcare is new-ish, but we certainly are looking for support from community and looking forward to everything that we can accomplish.
I love that call to action. So please go to empoweredhealthshow.com if you want more information on Times Up Healthcare. We have links out to different ways you can get involved or donate to them. And don't forget about donating to us on Patreon or our website. I'm Emily Kumler, and that was Empowered Health. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to check out our website at empoweredhealthshow.com for all the show notes, links to everything that was mentioned in the episode, as well as a chance to sign up for our newsletter and get some extra fun tidbits. See you next week.